God, being a Giants fan is so hard sometimes, or a lot of times actually. The Giants ended up losing to the Commanders 21 to 18. Meanwhile, the Giants offense scored 3 touchdowns, and the Giants defense, they held the Commanders to 0 touchdowns. So how did the Giants lose, you might ask? Oh, it's just because the Commanders kicked 7 field goals, and the Giants had no kicker, so they couldn't kick an extra point. They missed both their 2-point conversions. I mean, this team is just... They find unique ways to lose all the time, and hey, at least they're keeping a difference. They're keeping us fans on our toes. And I don't know this as fact, but I'd be willing to go out on a limb and say that no team has lost while scoring 3 touchdowns and the other team scoring 0. I have no clue if that's actually true, but I have a hard time believing any other team's done that before. And I mean, the one bright side, actually, I'll say there was a few bright sides to this game. The Giants did play well. I mean, if we had Graham Gano, we probably would have won this game, if we're being realistic. Assuming that he would have made all his extra points, we realistically could have won like 27 to 21. Because we were on field goal range a couple of times as well. Like, if we had Graham Gano, I'm confident we would have won this game, and I'm confident we were the better team this game. I mean, Daniel Jones had a bounce back game where he actually threw 2 touchdowns instead of throwing 2 picks. Granted, the Commanders' defense, especially their secondary, isn't anything special at all. They're probably one of the worst secondaries, if not the worst secondary in the league. And Daniel Jones still failed to, get a big-time throw. He had 0 big-time throws, but he also had 0 turnover-worthy plays, which is a really good sight to see for Daniel Jones. The offensive line also held up well. He only took 1 sack compared to 5 sacks he took against the Vikings. And his average depth of target also doubled from about 5 yards to about 10 yards. And a lot of that had to do with Malik Neighbors, which we'll get to in a little bit. And in total, he was only pressured 9 times, as opposed to 20 times against the Vikings. So, as long as Daniel Jones' pocket stays clean, he's able to make some pretty good throws. Devin Singletary also played a lot better. He had 10 forced missed tackles as opposed to 2 against the Vikings. And again, all of this needs to be taken into account that this was against the Commanders defense, who is very lacking in talent. But he had 4 10-plus yard runs as opposed to 0 against the Vikings. And the only bad thing Devin Singletary did, which was very, very costly, is he had that fumble around the 30-yard line. So if he didn't have that fumble, we again maybe could have won this game. There's a lot of things that fell into place that caused us to lose this game. Overall, the offensive line played better. Like I said, Andrew Thomas allowed 1 pressure, which did lead to a sack. But he also was way better in the run blocking game, and the offensive line in general was really good in run blocking today. John Runyon didn't allow a single pressure. He allowed 2 against the Vikings. John Michael Schmitz allowed 2 pressures. He only allowed 1 against the Vikings. Greg Van Roten allowed 2. He allowed 4 against the Vikings. And then Jermaine Illuminor allowed 2 pressures as opposed to 3 versus the Vikings. So all in all, the offensive line, held up a lot better. I still do think that right side of the offensive line with Greg Van Roten and Jermaine Illuminor are kind of the weak links to this offensive line. And I would still really want to see Evan Neal play right tackle ahead of Greg Van Roten just for a game, just to see how it is. Because I really do think Evan Neal could be a really good right guard. He's definitely not a good right tackle, but I think kicking him inside would, help him out a lot. And then moving on to the receiving core, I believe Malik Neighbors had 17 targets, while the rest of the team combined only had 9 targets. And Malik Neighbors went off. He had a career night with 10 catches for 127 yards and a touchdown. And a lot of that came on, short passes like drag routes and short in routes. And he just made a lot happen after the catch. I mean, he had 83 yards after the catch with an average of 8.3 yards per catch. So, I mean, a lot of his damage came in the short game, and he just made a lot happen with his feet, which is a good sign. It was very reminiscent of a guy who also came from LSU named Odell Beckham Jr. Now, I'm not going to get too hyperbolic here and say that Malik Neighbors is the next Odell Beckham, but it's really nice to see that we actually have a competent receiver that can make big plays, kind of like Odell Beckham. That's the last receiver we had that was of this caliber. And then Wan'Dale Robinson also had a touch on a little stick route, which was really nice. But aside from Malik Neighbors, the receiving core didn't do anything special. Darius Slayton did have a drop 2-point conversion, which was very, very crucial. But that's what Darius Slayton does, is he drops passes, especially ones that are a little bit tougher. It was a bit of a tough catch, but it hit him in the hands. He should have caught it. Moving on to the defense, it's kind of the same thing where the big three and Dexter Lawrence, Brian Burns, and Kayvon Thibodeau, kind of disappointed, especially against a very weak offensive line. I mean, Dexter Lawrence had 4 pressures and, 1 defensive stop, so not the most elite game from Dexter Lawrence, but, take into account just in a vacuum, it was still a good game just for his standards, maybe not the best of games. Kayvon Thibodeau had 3 pressures, which is a little bit of a bounce back game because in Minnesota he only had 1 pressure. Brian Burns had 2 pressures as opposed to 1 in Minnesota, which Brian Burns needs to get his pressures up. We signed Brian Burns and we traded for him to be an elite pass rusher to go alongside with Dexter Lawrence, and then that would hopefully cause Kayvon Thibodeau to have a better year as well. So we need Brian Burns to play a lot better than he is. 3 pressures in 2 games is not going to do it when you're considered a top pass rusher in this league. And then the big 3 only had 1 more pressure total than the game in Minnesota, which, I slammed them for not having enough pressures combined. So together they need to have more pressures than they have the past 2 games. Like I said, only 9 of the 17 total pressures from the game came from the big 3. The rest came from blitzes, and I think 1 came from Azeez Ojulari, and I think that was the only other defensive lineman that had a pressure. We did end up getting to Jaden Daniels 5 times for sacks, but all 5 of them came from, extra people. Like Jason Pinnock had, 2 sacks, which both were blitzes. Drew Phillips had a sack. So we didn't have a single sack from a defensive lineman. Granted, Jaden Daniels is a very shifty and elusive quarterback, so it's hard for defensive linemen to, get hands on him, but still, we just got to have more production from that defensive line in general. But the one bright side, the big bright spot from this defense is Drew Phillips is looking like a star. He didn't get many snaps last week, only 16 against the Vikings. He played 66 snaps against the Commanders. And he had a sack on Jaden Daniels, which was a really big play. He only allowed 5 receptions for 14 yards. A lot of them were obviously screen passes that he blew up. I mean, Drew Phillips, taking into account last week where he had a forced fumble on the only 16 snaps he played, like Drew Phillips is looking like a very, very good slot player for us. Tyler Nubin continues to play just really solid football. He's not giving up big plays. He's not really making game-changing plays, but he's just a very steady safety for us. Jason Pinnock had a pretty up-and-down game. He had the 2 sacks that I talked about earlier, but he allowed 45 yards, and he also missed 3 tackles, so I don't know. It was a bit of an up-and-down game. Like I said, the 2 sacks were big, but you can't miss 3 tackles and also give up 45 yards. That can't happen as a safety. But overall, like I said, Daniel Jones played a lot better than he did last week, so, that keeps Giants fans off his back for at least another week. Like I said, I think we could have won this game if Graham Gano didn't pull his hammy on the opening kickoff. We just find ways to lose, and, I don't really know who is to blame for this game. I'm not going to blame Brian Dable. I think he coached a good game. Daniel Jones played very well. The offense in general played well, even though it was really just a Malik Neighbors show. The defense also, I've never seen a defense bend so much but not break in a single game. It was really just that we didn't have Graham Gano. That was just the key to the whole game. But looking forward to the Browns. It's going to be the battle of, one of the 2 worst quarterbacks in the league, at least starting quarterbacks. So I'm sure we're going to find a way to lose that game as well. It'll just be in what fashion we do it. And if you like the video, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. And as always, I'm the Draft Nerd, and thanks for watching.